Hi, I'm Valen, and we're back with Adapting Percy Jackson. This is episode 3, entitled A Hippie in the Attic Reveals My Destiny.
It's been many years.
When we last left Percy, he had just suffered 2 attacks from within camp borders and discovered his true origin as a son of the Lord Under the Sea, Poseidon, realizing now that he's a much bigger player in this game of gods and men in the modern age. Episode 3 opens up where episode 2 closes, the Palace of Mount Olympus. With the nature of the source material, a unique shift in perspective felt like a necessary breath of fresh air. The bulk of the story up until this point has sensibly focused primarily on Percy's POV, as the book is told in the first person, and the plot centers around his journey of discovery to allow the audience to learn about the world alongside him. My decision to place scenes in Olympus as the setting for these characters so early on in the narrative was a choice I was firmly resolved on in the end, but one that took a lot of consideration in the earlier stages of writing. There's a bit of tonal dissonance between the original mythology and the Percy Jackson novels that I'm definitely going to talk at length about eventually, but here's the short version. The world these stories pull from is a violent one. The Greeks are tragedians by trade, telling stories of mature people dealing with mature issues. The world of Percy Jackson focuses on the youth, dealing with these adult topics when they need to in a much more digestible, family-friendly manner. That's because this is a coming-of-age story first, and it being a continuation of its mythological origins is merely the framework on which that story is built. The tropes of middle grade and young adult literature can be found throughout the series, going back to the very first page of The Lightning Thief. With these books being aimed towards a much younger demographic, it's natural for the bulk of the story to follow Percy and his friends, giving readers those keystone characters to identify with. Having the kids in the spotlight means that, consequentially, the gods are very much supporting characters, and are discussed because of their influence much more than they're actually shown. Whether that's the result of Rick's intention with the story, or simply a byproduct of how young adult novels tend to focus on the hero character's POV, that's something you'd have to ask him. But interestingly enough, there's also the dramatic component to this perspective choice. Leaving the Olympian gods, in this case particularly Zeus and Poseidon, the 2 brothers at the center of the conflict, leaving them as these ethereal, unseen entities up until the final chapters, brings in a sense of this resplendent theatricality and a certain ominous je ne sais quoi when they ultimately do show up. But when considering how best to visually tell the story of these 2 warring brothers, I realized the POV limitations of the novels created inherent problems when trying to communicate the events occurring outside of that POV, and the lack of focus on the gods themselves means there's storytelling potential that begs to be explored. Instead of hearing about the arguments the gods are having, we can see them play out. Instead of being told about the accusations Zeus is levying, we can hear it in his own words. How does Poseidon feel about this? What about the other Olympians? What reactions do they have to new information? We can experience these conflicts much more intimately when we have a direct line into their emotions and opinions. The way I see it, going the entire season without introducing Zeus and Poseidon properly would be a disservice to not just the characters and their rich histories, but also to the natural flow of exposition throughout the story. Without Zeus as the mouthpiece for the plot, everything that happens comes down through various ancillary sources, and it always results in so many influences. Granted, this is an info-dumpy series by nature, and there is an expectation going in that there are going to be these moments that are mostly for the audience. But it shouldn't be the ideal. I think this solution can mitigate the awkward second-hand spoon-feeding nature of much of the book exposition, and beyond that, we can use these scenes as an opportunity to creatively establish the relationship between the 2 brothers, understand how the conflict became what it is now, and get an idea of what's at stake should the solstice deadline pass. So we open on Zeus speaking to several nymphs who fly off into the wind, then in what is clearly a regular occurrence between the 2, Poseidon and Zeus throw blame, threaten, and ultimately end up at each other's throats, which causes the other Olympians to get involved. We learn that Zeus has made a sacred oath on the river Styx to wait until the summer solstice before involving himself in the conflict, but when he eventually does, he promises Poseidon that Percy will be the first casualty of the new Olympian War. Returning to camp, a security detail is set up around the barrier while most of the campers quietly get ready for bed. The counselors and camp staff all crowd into the big house for an emergency meeting to discuss the attack. Percy begins to explain that the Hellhound wasn't in fact the first monster to attack the camp, and Lyra enters the scene to describe the monster from the night previously as a Theron Draken. Here, like before, we can see glimpses of there being more to Lyra than meets the eye, but there is still too little to go off of. She apologizes for not alerting anyone sooner, then Chiron interjects, implying the attacks were intentional assaults from spies on the inside. Dionysus takes this as his cue to suggest what should be done with Percy. Burned to ashes, turned into a dolphin, anything that takes this hassle of a demigod off his hands. We're left with the lingering fear of espionage in the air as Chiron sends Percy away to Cabin 3 so they may decide his fate. We have a few quick scenes of Percy training in an attempt to control his water powers, then we come to another dream sequence that echoes his dream from the previous episode. Grover and Percy stand waiting outside the big house the next morning. They both appear rather nervous, and they have a short conversation about this big secret on Olympus and what will ultimately be decided about Percy's existence. A few additions here of my own. I added a little context for the secrecy of the stolen bolt, solidifying it as an Olympian edict to not speak about the theft. Beyond that, it's clarified that this governing body for the camp known as the Archontes is led by Chiron and Mr. D, with camp counselors and magical creatures acting in advisor roles. They enter the building as the other counselors and nymphs exit, and Chiron presents Percy his ultimatum: go on a quest to save the world, or be submitted to the not-so-tender mercies of Mr. D. He chooses the former and is sent up the stairs to visit the Oracle of Delphi, speaker of the prophecies of Phoebus Apollo, slayer of the mighty Python. She wakes up from her mummified state, vomits green smoke, provides him a few lines of iambic pentameter that make no sense, as is tradition, of course, then returns to a moldy fruit roll-up. When he makes his way back downstairs to meet Chiron and Grover, the truth is finally revealed to him, with a history lesson on the godly weapons of power as a backdrop. Much of this scene is torn straight from the book, which is remedied in a future draft, with long rambling spurts of dialogue, but you get the gist of it. Zeus blames Poseidon for the theft, Percy by extension is the prime suspect, and we have until the summer solstice to return it, lest we invoke a godly war of nuclear proportions. So if it wasn't Percy, then who could have stolen the weapon? Something that every single version of the Lightning Thief has done that is frankly kind of insane to me is create this reliance on a single person for the direction of the entire quest. Chiron believes Hades is the true thief.
The Lord of the Dead is the only possibility.
Oh, is he now? Turns out Kronos knew exactly what to do to pull Chiron's strings. Oh, yeah. Spoilers. Hey, you made it this far, it's too late now. You should have read the book. Many of the gods and even camp leaders were, in fact, manipulated to blame Hades for the theft. Now, Rick made sure to establish a lot of very reasonable parameters that would lead anyone with sense to believe Hades to be the culprit. The prophecy says they have to travel west to face the god who was turned. The main entrance to the underworld is located in LA, making him a perfect candidate. The thief is someone who is either searching for conflict between the gods or the power to overthrow them entirely. Hades, known for his vendetta against his brothers for many reasons, fits the bill for this too. A Fury tried to kill Percy. In my version, it's a kidnapping, but the principle is the same. Furies obey only one lord. A hellhound can only be summoned from the fields of punishment. He assumes that the spy in the camp serves Hades, which would make more sense than anyone else we're aware of. Who else could have access to the underworld like that? However, there are equally as many reasons to believe that Hades couldn't possibly be responsible. You shall travel west to face the god who is turned? What exactly isn't west of New York? That's a lot of square footage to write off just because
City of Angels?
More like City of Devils.
The underworld is in Los Angeles.
You want the gods to fight? You want to overthrow them?
I'd rather die in the mud with those men than live forever as a god.
When I spit in the eyes of the gods, then I'll smile.
Don't become one of them.
You god, not today, bitch!
Gee, how many gods, titans, demigods, and estranged lovers do you think are out there that wouldn't give their left nut just to see Zeus taken down a peg? Here's a strange line too. His kingdom would grow powerful with the deaths of millions. This kind of confuses me. How would that make his kingdom more powerful? Can he summon the souls of the dead to become his little zombie army? Maybe? It's in fact confirmed later on that the amount of dead souls down there causes him more headaches than anything else, but why does Chiron comment on this to begin with? Even not knowing Hades' true feelings, it's hard to make the assumption that it it would be massively beneficial to him, as the gajillions of souls already down there would make perfect fodder for a zombie army. Is Chiron just fully ignorant of how the underworld works and is making blind assumptions? The answer is yes. Lastly, if Hades is the thief, why would he send his fury to kill Percy? This is an issue with the book that I changed primarily because it's a conflict of motive in narrative, not just a conflict here. We talked in episode 1 about Mrs. Dodd's whole
Die, honey.
that whole shtick, and how it throws off Hades' later established motive of not stopping him from entering the underworld and just wanting his helm returned to him. But in this case, it adds an additional layer of confusion. If you were actually the culprit, why would you kill the demigod that you're planning on framing for the theft? If Percy suddenly dies, that automatically draws suspicion elsewhere. And if that cause of death is traced back to the Fury, then guess who becomes the prime suspect? Because of Chiron's assumption, the trio ends up going on a 10-day wild goose chase to the underworld to, well, we'll get there. I'm not saying Chiron's assumptions are poorly founded, because they aren't. The involvement of the Fury and Hellhound alone are fairly strong indicators of the Lord of the Dead's involvement in some capacity. As well, Chiron mentions having heard a prophecy of his own, and there's an implication that Hades might be mentioned as the one Percy has to go face. But none of us know what his prophecy says. It could have a line that says, "A boy of 12 shall travel below and face the land where dead souls go." And that would track. Or it could be something as vague as Olympian theft, a god helped out. The dude was evil. Yeah, no doubt. And Chiron's just like,
Yeah, maybe Hades. He's probably evil.
my primary gripe is in what I said before. Chiron is the single point of failure in this massive leap from hypothesis to unquestionable fact. Nobody doubts or questions the validity of his claim, and there are no counter-assumptions to anyone else. They assume it's him because, realistically, that's the best guess anybody's going to come up with. And that's all well and good, but when we place less emphasis on Chiron as the sole arbiter over the identity of the lightning thief, it hopefully removes that sense of shooting in the dark that might otherwise hang over the quest. My solution to deal with this was fairly simply adding a third party's voice to give his assumption that sense of validity that it desperately needs. In this case, Percy is shown a sign by his father when staying in cabin 3. The symbol of Hades appears glowing in the bottom of a pool of water. When Chiron reveals an illustration of that same symbol during his explanation, Percy points it out as a sign sent by his father, and Chiron's suspicions become instantly more credible. This isn't a massive fix that alters the course of events throughout the story, but if we can convince the audience that there is a larger amount of support for this theory of Hades being responsible, that reinforced credibility will pay massive dividends when the twist is ultimately revealed. Moving forward, another big issue with the plot is introduced almost immediately. And this one is actually a big problem. They don't have a plan. No, really. The entirety of our trio's strategic outline for retrieving the bolt is to go to the underworld, find the bolt. Here's the golden quote from Chiron.
Hades sent a minion to steal the master bolt. He hid it in the underworld, knowing full well that Zeus would blame Poseidon. I don't pretend to understand the Lord of the Dead's motives perfectly, or why he chose this time to start a war, but one thing is certain. Percy must go to the underworld, find the Master Bolt, and reveal the truth.
So, yeah, sorry, I guess I stand corrected. Reveal the truth? It cannot be emphasized enough how ridiculous it is to spend an entire cross-country trip not even knowing where the bolt is located or how you actually intend to retrieve it. Only to, once you arrive, and I shit you not, this is what happens, walk up to the dread king of the underworld himself and say, "Can I have it pretty please with a cherry on top? After all, don't you know that war is..." In any case, the solution here is to give them an actual heading. In this instance, their plan is simple. We steal the bolt back. The concept is a bit silly, over the top, and even poetic. robbing the thief by stealing the stolen item, which I think adds to Percy's character as a bit of an outside-the-box thinker, and the sheer insanity of the statement lends to the group's collective lack of self-limitations. Grover, of course, is going to state all the ways in which they're doomed to fail, but remains committed nonetheless, and Percy is no more deterred himself, knowing in the back of his mind that their destination is also where he may be able to find his mother, kicking him into a much more active role. So the quest is issued and Annabeth volunteers as tribute, making 3 total traveling west to Los Angeles. As they leave, they are greeted by campers and magical creatures who wait at the bottom of the hill to see them off. They're given gifts from Luke, Chiron, and even Lyra, who provides them some magical jasper pendants. They make their way into town with the help of Argus, and we get a bit of a montage of our heroes waiting in the bus station, enjoying the change of scenery while they can. We're going to put a bit of extra emphasis on Annabeth's perspective in particular here, since she hasn't been allowed to leave camp for many years and is seeing the world with fresh eyes. We take the opportunity here to introduce a few concepts as well, namely Annabeth's rivalry with Percy, Grover's empath abilities, and Gabe's scent protecting Percy all these years. I spent a good deal of time fleshing out the idea of monster and demigod scent, as it was incredibly vague in the book, and we need solid rules to understand what the stakes are in these monster attacks, and exactly what causes and covers detection. This is where aura comes in. For humans, it's not just the physical smell of a person, and it isn't necessarily their moral character that causes a strong smell either. In Gabe's case, the unique combination of his regular habits that create his strong physical scent, his closed-minded mentality, and his relatively low intellect all combine to create the perfect storm of an all-natural monster repellent. Sally kept Percy close to Gabe all these years to keep the monsters at bay, knowing Poseidon's power would cause him to be more vulnerable to attacks. When no local school would take him anymore, Yancey became the best option, and Sally ensured she would send him away with Gabe's jacket and hope it would be enough to cover him for the school year. Obviously, this wasn't actually enough, which led us to where we are now, but the practice of keeping the jacket around is an incredibly important detail that holds to the mechanics I've set in place here. Hopefully, all put together, this element of the story makes more sense and can help the audience understand the significance of Gabe's jacket, as well as Sally's decision to sacrifice her own personal endeavors to protect her son. We also briefly mentioned Percy's waking up, which was briefly touched on last episode when I went over the mist. This is a similar mechanic to the last one in that it relates to scent, but for demigods, your potency relates to your power. Like a superhero, your powers won't necessarily appear until you've matured to a certain degree, and the extent of your power directly correlates genetically to the extent of your parents' power. Being the son of Poseidon, Percy's moment of awakening is a bit of an upset in the monster world. In that moment, the potency of his scent multiplied, attracting the attention of not only the Arinyas, but Grover, who was so blown away by his aura that he had Chiron come to the school personally to observe it. Of course, this is all to say,
oh, brother, this guy stinks!
The bus finally arrives, and our trio begins to make their way west. I felt it was important in moments like this to emphasize the mortal attention he would be receiving. A missing persons case wouldn't be big news, but I wanted to use this as an opportunity to drive up the tension of the obstacles these kids are facing, not just as heroes fighting off monsters, but as children avoiding the attention of the mortal police. We have a brief scene where an officer inspects the bus and even asks Grover and Annabeth a few questions, with Percy hidden by the invisibility cap. Once they pass this trial, however, things get much worse for them. Harpies, with a much greater bloodlust than the ones at camp, catch a whiff of the godlings on the bus and fly after them in hot pursuit. Admittedly, this is a first draft.
There you go. A first draft. Official first draft.
And yeah, there is a lot of they fighting here.
Of course, there's a lot of cheating in there. A lot of they fight.
But keep in mind, this is the pre-Disney Plus version of the scripts. You won't find any bias in this draft, so even if a lot of it is unpolished, I can at least still have a clear conscience in showcasing it without robbing the new series of their good ideas. That'll be for the end of this series. The Harpies attack the bus, pop the tires, and steal their duffel bag full of helpful quest items. They chase after them into the woods, knowing that they can't make it all the way to Los Angeles without that bag. Losing the monsters after a few minutes, they slow down and rely on Grover's nose to move in the right direction. We get a brief moment teasing Annabeth's family tensions, then they stumble upon an old, isolated diner. Much like in the original book, the Emporium is seemingly in the middle of nowhere, with a neon sign above and a handful of large statues scattered around the premises. A woman sits on a bench up on the wooden deck connected to a diner cart with the grills on. The woman appears alone at first, but inside the cart, 2 additional women are seen working in the kitchen. The seated woman, upon noticing the children, gives them a concerned look. offering to let them take a seat and have some food. Our heroes, however, don't budge an inch. The woman, I guess I'll reveal it early. The Gorgon Medusa drops the act, addressing them as demigods, and we hear monsters rustling in the background. They jump out past her to attack, and we can see that these monsters are the same harpies from before. Annabeth and the boys are separated, with Percy and Grover fighting a horde in the greenhouse area. Annabeth fights off 2 harpies, with Medusa observing her with interest from a distance. The Gorgon begins talking about Annabeth's mother, the goddess Athena, and tries to convince her to turn on Percy. Once Annabeth begins to put the pieces together, she runs away before Medusa removes her headdress fully. The boys begin to realize the same as they notice the statues, and we see the 2 sisters in the kitchen melt into snakes, the dark magic coming apart like threads of fabric. We begin to see pieces of Medusa's story come into form as she monologues, walking through the greenhouse in search of the hidden trio. She was a servant of Athena, wronged by the gods after falling in love with Poseidon. Her eternal punishment has caused her so much grief that she's fallen into utter insanity. She explains that offering the children up to the gods as stone would be the perfect revenge for all of them, genuinely trying to convince them on the merits of the idea. There are actually several prominent interpretations of Medusa's transformation story, and I feel that the one Rick went with was effective, but not nearly as emotionally resonant as it could be. The book makes Athena her enemy and gives her a loving sense of affection for Percy because she still loves his father. I made a few changes to this story. While Medusa's feelings towards Athena are not necessarily warm, she still holds a sort of nostalgic fondness for her, despite her punishment, because it was Poseidon that convinced her to break her vow of celibacy in the first place, and when she was caught in the act in Athena's own temple and cursed, he disappeared. So long as she could be with her love, the punishment disgracing her patron goddess was worth it to her. But once Poseidon abandoned her, she felt truly betrayed. When Poseidon did eventually return, he became angry and turned her sisters into the same monsters as she, and the last thing he did was transform her into the murderous monster we know her as. It was he who gave her the power to transform her enemies to stone with just a glance. The first casualties of this ability, which she had not yet fully comprehended, were her 2 sisters, Uriel and Stheno, and thus her rampage began. I recommend checking out the full short story I wrote for additional context. I really think the tragedy aspect of Medusa's character is so important to understand her motives here, and I had a lot of fun exploring her story in particular. Link is down below for that. The 3 trick her into letting her guard down, then at the perfect moment, Percy uses the reflection of Annabeth's knife to behead the Gorgon. The head, a relic like the Minotaur's horn, stays while the rest of her body turns to ash. Percy and Annabeth have a moment of shared understanding that their rivalry is stupid, and that both of their parents have made their fair share of mistakes. As Percy takes the head into the back room, Grover and Annabeth ask what he plans to do with it. As he packs it into a box, they both let him know how bad of an idea it is to send the head to Olympus, and Percy responds by assuring them that he is impertinent. Cut to black, end credits roll, and bam, that's episode 3. Full disclosure, a lot of work in that last scene didn't actually make it into the earlier version of the script. Many of the notes in the first draft were things like, throughout the fight they make their way through the Garden Gnome Emporium, and revealed that Medusa's sisters are not actually alive. A lot of the emotional depth of Medusa and the majority of her dialogue don't appear until a later draft, which I'll be posting the final draft of these scripts eventually, but these videos take a long time to make and there isn't a real timeline at this point anymore. The series will go on until I've hit everything I want to touch on, so we'll see how long that actually takes. But the thing I like the most about this episode is that we've hit the turning point, and we can see Percy becoming a truly active protagonist. Up until the issuing of the quest, he's mostly a vessel for the audience to receive information and have things happen to him, whereas now he's starting to form a relationship with his questmates, and he and Annabeth in particular are learning to sort out a lot of their personal issues with each other. Behind the scenes, of course, there's a lot more going on in terms of spoiler territory plot things, but I figure I'll let the mystery unravel on its own. Hopefully my changes made enough sense in the areas where I felt they needed them, and I really hope you enjoyed my attempts at improving the world-building elements of the story in particular. If nothing else, that was the big focus in terms of fixes for a lot of the episode. Either way, let me know what you thought of the script if you read it, and I'd be interested in hearing if you agree with me on some of these big changes. But honestly, I'm curious to hear which changes you may disagree with. What would you have done differently? Thanks again for watching. The next video in sequence to be released is my reaction to the Disney Plus version of episode 3. For now, that'll do it. See you next time.
I'm all set. All I need is an idea.